again and welcome to this video on Ayurvedic nutrition. So in this video we're going to discuss how Ayurvedic nutrition maybe differs a little bit from Western nutrition. As well, we're going to look at particularly the 6 tastes, because this is really how Ayurveda deals with nutrition. We'll look at the 6 tastes, and as well I have brought a whole assortment of food to show you some of those ingredients so you can start to get a feel for the foods you may have in your own home. You know, what are the predominant tastes you have in your own home, or you may have in your diet, and how might that be affecting the balance within your body? As well, we're going to then talk about how to work with the 6 tastes and the doshas. So, when we look at diving in, when we compare Western nutrition to Ayurvedic nutrition, the Western nutrition model is in some ways much more quantitative. So when you look at Western nutrition, you will often see counting calories, counting protein, counting grams of fats. You also have this comparison between macronutrients and micronutrients, so things like vitamins and minerals, these sort of biomarkers, so things that are much more quantitative in their essence. Whereas from the Ayurvedic perspective, and as well Ayurvedic anatomy, we're not so much concerned with what is the more quantitative view of the body, but rather what is the qualitative view of the body. Because just as an example, eating the same amount of calories of avocado as celery, from the Ayurvedic perspective, will have very different results. They'll have very different effects on your body because of what is actually the quality of these foods. So it's not so much about the precise quantitative model, but it's more about the qualitative model. What is the effect the food has on the body? Which this then brings us to really the Ayurvedic understanding of the 6 tastes. Because as well, it's not the same thing from the Ayurvedic perspective to eat a fresh, refreshing avocado in the middle of winter as it is to eat it in the middle of summer. So it will have a greater ability to balance your body in the summer than maybe it will in the winter, because its sort of cold, heavy qualities maybe actually resemble what's already happening in the outside world in the wintertime. So you want to begin to actually examine, what is the outer world telling me, and how can actually my body respond a little better to that by being more in balance? And how can I cultivate that balance from within using the foods I'm eating? This is where Ayurveda is really concerned. So, as well, from the Ayurvedic perspective, the top 3 things that we're really concerned about when it comes to cultivating a very healthy body, cultivating a very imbalanced experience of the human body, are 3 things. The first is going to be Agni. So we've discussed Agni in some of our other videos, but Agni really is so vital when it comes to nutrition because it is actually the process by which we turn any foodstuffs into your body. So Agni is fire. It's transformative power of the universe, and that transformative power of your stomach, of your liver, of every single cell in your body to then take whatever food you may have eaten and make it into you. Make it into every single cell in your body and allow it to build every single part of your tissue. So in this way, Agni is really vital. And using foods, we can understand how we may actually be able to boost our Agni, boost our fire with something like a chili pepper, or we may boost it too much, right? Your Agni may already be too high, and this might cause acid indigestion, for example. So we also might have foods that cool our Agni down, something like coconut water. So this refreshing, hydrating drink, if you have low Agni already, and then you're taking a kale smoothie, for example, with coconut water, and you already have a weak digestion, weak appetite, Ayurveda would say that this is actually doing more harm than good. Even if from the Western perspective, you might be getting all of the macronutrients, all of the minerals, all of the vitamins, with Ayurveda, if your Agni is not supported by that food, you're not going to be absorbing the food. And so it doesn't matter what you eat, it matters more how well you digest it. So Ayurveda is much more concerned with this question. The second thing to look at is Amma. So Amma is any type of food that goes undigested. So any type of nourishment, really, that goes undigested. Because Amma can be more than just food. Amma can also be an experience. So when we look at psychological trauma, for example, when you have some experience that has not yet been processed, And because it has not been processed, you've not taken from it what you can take from it as nourishing to your future, and you cannot leave behind yet what is the more detrimental part of it, then you are walking around with both of these things. And both of these things, still unprocessed, get clogged in your channels, get clogged in your mind, for example. And this makes it almost like seeing through a fogged up glass. So it's considered that Amma does the exact same thing on the physical level as maybe psychological trauma would. When you have food that goes undigested, because maybe your Agni was not strong enough to digest it, there's still parts of it stuck in your system. So sort of given this same metaphor of like having a glass through which your consciousness looks through, when you have Amma, there's actually something stuck to that glass. There's something fogging up that glass. And when that happens, your clear perception becomes much more difficult. And so Amma does two things in the body that are related to the disease process. One is it actually clogs channels through which prana can flow. So prana is life force energy. And so if there's a lot of Amma in the body, then prana cannot flow freely. And when prana cannot flow freely, this is when you start to have imbalances that are directly related to the doshas. So for example, if you have Amma blocking the flow of prana, then you're going to have on one side it being stagnant, and on the other side it being totally deficient. The energy of deficiency is related to vata, the energy of the stagnancy is related to kapha, and the energy of the blockage itself is most often related to Pita. In this case, we're still discussing Amma. And Amma can take any of those forms. It can be Kapha Amma, Pitta Amma, Vata Amma, but this maybe goes a little bit beyond the scope of this video. The second thing that Amma does is by clogging up the channels of perception of your consciousness, of your cellular consciousness, it actually then can sometimes make your body act out. And so when we look at things like autoimmune disease, this is actually when the body itself starts to attack your own cells. And so while we may consider that, yes, maybe you eat one type of food from the Western perspective, and this type of food is actually what's then causing that autoimmune disease, say wheat, for example. A lot of people cannot digest wheat. From the Ayurvedic perspective, there's some issue deeper with the Agni that actually then causes Amma to be produced. And because there is that Amma produced within the system, the unprocessed material, this is then what your body has a reaction to. Your body doesn't have a clear glass, a clear window through which to see. So imagine having to drive at night and you can't even see through your window. This is almost what we're asking our body to do when we have a lot of Amma in the body. When we're eating foods that are too heavy or too much for us to digest. So once again, it's not so much about, is this the good food on paper, right? Maybe the kale and the apple and all of these cold hard fruits or vegetables might look really good when we look at the vitamins and the antioxidant count. But if you can't digest them, from the Ayurvedic perspective, you're actually going to create perhaps more harm than good. The third thing we're really concerned about within Ayurvedic nutrition is building Ojas. So ideally, if the Agni is strong, if your fire is strong, you will not be building Amma. If you have Amma, you still want to go back to that first step because you want to be able to burn it off. And you want to be able to create the circumstances within the body where you're not creating more of it. So you're always going back to Agni. Once you have strong Agni, and once you have also balanced the levels of Amma in the body, you've taken those out, the third step then would be to build Ojas. Ojas is considered to be the refined quality of Kapha dosha. So remember, Kapha provides structure and lubrication to the body. And because Kapha provides structure and lubrication, this is actually sort of the essence of being alive, right? This is the essence of every cell, every tissue in your body needs this because we have a physical body that is the vehicle for our spirit. But we actually need something to feed that, to nourish that physical vessel. And what is going to imbue that physical vessel and every cell in your body with vitality and energy and enthusiasm and immunity? This is Ojas. So once we have balanced Agni, once we've dealt with Amma, then we want to be building Ojas within the body. And having a balanced nutrition of the 6 tastes is something that's going to allow us to optimally build the Agni, to remove Amma, and then to as well build Ojas within the body. So, we're now going to look at the 6 tastes themselves. So when we look at the 6 tastes, we also want to consider, why is Ayurveda so concerned with the tastes? For one thing, thousands of years ago, when Ayurveda was being developed, we maybe didn't have the same capacity to measure the quantitative nutrients and the quantitative minerals, the quantitative aspects of the food that we ate. But nevertheless, what we did have was an understanding of what were the effects on the body. And this is perhaps maybe even more important, because from one perspective, you may be able to go out and ask a nutritionist, what should I eat? Where really the question from Ayurveda would say, what do you have at your disposal? What do you want to eat? What does your internal drive ask you to eat? What do your cravings ask of you? Because this is very valuable information to know what your body is actually wanting, what at a cellular level your body actually wants or needs to happen. So this is often related to the cravings, and the way the body does that is from the cellular level. When there is a need, it will trigger neurotransmitters to the brain to basically invite in a certain type of craving. The same thing happens with hunger. When your cells are not bathed in a proper level of blood sugar, then your blood sugar level has already dropped, say a few hours after a meal. You're actually expending energy on digesting the meal you just ate, and you haven't yet received the nutrients from it. So maybe you start to get hungry again, for example, even though that full digestive process hasn't finished. Because the cells are not bathed in blood sugar, they're not bathed in the proteins that have yet come from the next meal, they signal hunger to the brain. So this is something that we want to be aware of. As well, with each of the 6 tastes, they actually set off a cascade of chemical reactions throughout the body. And so this is something that even modern science knows to be true. For example, there's a study about patients who took diet cola, so diet cola that had no calories in it and had artificial sweeteners, and others who took the standard version that had sugar or that had, calories to it. When they compared these 2 groups of was one able to lose weight, they actually found that both gained the same amount of weight, drinking the exact same thing, as if they were drinking the exact same thing. But really, the brain perceived that they were drinking the exact same thing because the brain was able to perceive a sweet taste. And part of what the sweet taste does in the body is it triggers the body to hold on to nutrients. So all of these tastes and how they work with our tongue, how they work with our neurotransmitters, how they work with our neurotransmitting receptors is actually based on thousands of years of evolution. So for example, when we think about today, we maybe have refined sugar, refined flour, we have a lot of things that are very building, right? You can go out and buy a tub of protein powder. For our ancestors, thousands of years ago, coming across the sweet taste, the taste that builds our tissue, was actually much more difficult. Fruits only came around at a certain time of year. You had to plant and harvest grains. You had to wait for that time. And if you still wanted something like fat or protein, most of the time it had to come from animals or nuts. And so, in this way, sweet taste was much more difficult to come by. But because it's so essential to building our tissue, when we were actually able to get it, in order to survive, in order for us to be a functional being, this triggered, I've eaten the sweet taste, it's time to build tissue. And so this brings us to our first taste, which is the sweet taste. It really has that quality of setting off cascades of building. And so it builds our tissue, it builds our body up, it builds the cells, it builds the muscles. And for this reason, the sweet taste is more than just sugar. The sweet taste is really what, from the Western perspective, we look at as being the macronutrients. So anything that has a high quality of protein, high quality of fat, high quality of carbohydrates is considered to be the sweet taste. So I brought some sweet taste foods here just so you can see. Example can be things like potato. If you think about eating a ton of potatoes, right? This helps build your tissues. It's very solid, complex carbohydrate. As well, things like sweet potatoes have a lot of vitamins and nutrition, but nevertheless, because of their very sweet taste, they're a very grounding, very earthy thing, but they also build our tissue. Foods like carrot, foods like avocado. So if you've ever, for example, had carrot juice, you'll know that while maybe when you eat a carrot, it doesn't seem so sweet, if you cook it or you juice it, you immediately find out how sweet it actually is. With an avocado, for example, this food is very rich in fat and very rich in carbohydrates. It's very dense in its nutrition. And because it's so dense in its nutrition, it helps build our own nutrition density. We also have foods like plantains or bananas. So all of these are very building foods. I also have here an example of almonds. And we'll come back to this idea a bit later, but for example, the skin of the almond, I've soaked these overnight. The skin of the almond actually has qualities related more to a different taste, which we'll get to in just a bit. But the almond itself is considered very building. It has a lot of protein, a lot of nutrition. And so when we take the skin off, we actually take off the astringent taste, and we can eat just the sweetness of the almond. I've also included oil. So this is sesame oil. Oil is a very nutritious thing for the body. Every single cell in your body needs to have a whole layer of lipids or fat, oil essentially, around it in order to form its membrane. So oil is a very important part of any healthy diet. Whereas from the Western perspective, it's very high in fat. From the Ayurvedic perspective, you need fat. You need a certain amount of fat to survive, to be healthy. When you don't, this might actually start to send your body into thinking that there's not enough. There's not enough sweetness in your life. There's not enough contentment. There's not enough satisfaction. Because on the cellular level, that's not what you're experiencing. And so it'll be very difficult for your brain, for your mind, to send a different signal. I've also brought dates, for example, blueberries, strawberries. So all of the fruits that we can think about that have a sweet taste can be very building to the body, very nourishing to our tissues. And today we're lucky enough to live in a day and age where we have so much of the sweet taste at our capacity, at our disposal. And this is perhaps why, from the Ayurvedic perspective, that we see such high levels of obesity, right? We actually have much more capacity to build our bodies than perhaps we ever did before. We have the sweet taste in excess, in abundance. And nevertheless, we also have many sources that are very refined. With Ayurveda, you always want to go back to the source. You want to go back to as pure of the substance as you can. So this covers a bit of the sweet taste. The 6 tastes, because I forgot to mention that, the 6 tastes are sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter, and astringent. So we covered the sweet taste. The next taste is sour. So some things that I've included that are sour include things like lime, things like oranges, right? Oranges can also be quite sweet. And so this is another example of how foods can actually have multiple benefits. Foods can have multiple tastes going on. Kiwi sometimes can be more sweet, sometimes can be more sour. The peel of the orange, for example, or the peel of the lime, when we peel these, you can actually make a tea out of these because they're bitter. You can chew these and they're bitter, and so they can help have those benefits on the digestion that we'll talk about when we get to bitter. Other things that are considered to be sour within Ayurveda would actually be things like yogurt. So yogurt is naturally soured milk. It's been soured by the probiotics that are living in it. And so anything that is generally fermented, this includes alcohol as well, is considered to be sour taste. I also have some sauerkraut, and so this is another fermented product, right, of just mixing the cabbage, which is bitter, with salt. And so here you have bitter, salty, and the sour of the natural vinegar that this product starts to create as well from its fermentation process. When we look at the sour taste, the cascade that the sour taste sets off in the body is very much related to increasing fluid flow. And so what does that mean? So if I were to cut this lime and squeeze it into my mouth, squeeze it into my tongue, you maybe remember from being a kid and trying sour candies or something, or maybe trying this with the lime, of that first time that you puckered up because of the sour taste. And so when you first get that exposure to the sour taste, what happens is immediately you start to flush saliva into your mouth. So when we look at the capacity of the sour taste, really what it does is it allows for the flow of fluid across membranes. It draws fluids to wherever it is, ideally so that you can actually flush it out of your body. Because if you think about it, it's related to acid. And when it's too high of an acid, this can actually do damage to the cells. So your body actually wants to flush it with fluid in order to flush and dilute that acid so it can flush it out. When we look at your stomach acid, however, this is very beneficial. So sour is actually a very important taste, and it's why things like fermented foods or things like yogurt why these can actually often, in addition to any probiotics they may have, they may also have this benefit of being sour taste, of drawing more fluid into the digestive system. And so for someone with a dry digestive system, someone who is dehydrated, and because when we eat a food, it goes down into your stomach, you need to be able to produce and pull fluid from your body, from your tissues, to create the hydrochloric acid necessary to actually digest any of the food you've eaten. And if you are lacking any of that fluidity in your body, when you take the sour taste, that same puckering that you had in your mouth, the same flushing of saliva, will happen all the way down into your digestive tract. And this is actually really what we want. We want to be able to get more fluidity into your digestive tract in order to support the digestion. So this is a big thing that sour taste does. It's considered building in the way that it actually adds more fluidity to the tissue. The next taste is salty. So salty is another building taste. Here I have some Himalayan salt, so Himalayan pink salt. I have coconut water, and I also have some olives, some black olives. So the olives themselves, if you've ever had a very fresh olives are very bitter. And actually part of what is done commercially when we're working with olives in order to cut the bitter taste is they're brined in salt water. So this makes them a nice source of salty taste, for example. Another source can also be celery. So celery is very high in a lot of things like sodium or things like potassium to actually be able to hold on to the same amount of fluids as any of these other salty things. So when we look at the effects of the salty taste in particular, salt, right? If I'm looking at salt or coconut water, these are known as electrolytes. So these help us to hold on to fluid. When you think about what salt does, if you have a salt shaker and you leave it open, it draws in the water, right? This is why, at least here in Mexico, we put rice oftentimes into a salt shaker to absorb some of that water coming from the air so that you can actually still shake the salt. Otherwise, exposed to the humidity, it will absorb all of the moisture and become a brick. This is part of what salt does. And when we look at that inside of our bodies, the same thing happens. And so sometimes you can be drinking a ton of water, right? You drink water and it seems to just go right through you. You maybe drink a big glass of water and then you immediately run to the restroom and it's very clear fluid that comes out of you. What's actually happening is you just drank water. This otherwise would raise your blood pressure. So your body, your kidneys have to regulate the blood pressure that just raised in your body and actually flush fluids out. Because that water, as it came into your body, was not able to be held by your tissues. The reason from the Ayurvedic perspective that it was not being able to be held in your tissues was a lack of the salty taste, was a lack of electrolytes within your cells. So if your cells inside of the cell does not have enough salty taste, it does not have enough of these minerals, then it's not able to actually hold on to, pull in the water like the salt shaker pulls the water in from the air and hold on to it. So because it doesn't have that within its own tissue, the water just passes right through. So this is why the salty taste is then very important for a dosha like Vata dosha, which we'll discuss a bit later, because we want to be able to balance the dryness using this taste. When it comes to our next taste, we're going to look at, I'm going to mention one thing actually because I forgot. When we look at foods like blueberry, right, foods like strawberry, these are also quite sour. And so while they can be sweet, they can also be sour. Just the orange, for example, can be sour mostly and also can be sweet. And so you're looking at this way in foods that have multiple benefits, right? The coconut water can also be somewhat considered sweet. It's very building, right? It helps us build fluids. And it also has that salty taste. So the next taste that we're going to look at is the pungent taste. The pungent taste can also be considered spicy. So when we look at the pungent taste from the Ayurvedic perspective, this includes foods that are spicy and foods that are aromatic. So when you think of a lot of herbs, for example, a lot of herbs actually follow under the pungent taste. So even things like basil or lavender or sage, right, eucalyptus, right, these things, these herbs, they actually have that same quality of opening, which is what we're going to discuss with the pungent taste. So if you think about when you chop an onion, when you take a slice of raw ginger into your mouth, or if you were to eat a clove of garlic, or you were to take a bite out of a chili pepper, all of these are pungent foods. And immediately the effect they have is dilation. So these foods can be, depending on their strength, they can be somewhat irritating to our tissues. And so perhaps if you've had a very spicy meal at some point, you know that it irritated you all the way through your digestive tract. When we're looking at working with the pungent taste, what it can do is it does pull together more fluids. It does pull more blood flow. So as well, when you think about rubbing a chili pepper onto your hands, you cut a chili pepper, and if you were to touch your eye would get very red as it gets that burning sensation. The red is actually from blood that is coming to that area to flush it with fluid to help repair any damaged tissues that may have been burnt. So in this way, we're actually able to use it beneficially when you want to work with something like opening the lungs, right? This is why the aromatic taste is useful. For example, using cardamom is known to be the #1 mucus destroyer in Ayurveda. So you include cardamom in your meal, and it's actually able to help open up the lungs so that you can breathe better. It brings more blood flow and warmth into the body. And so this is why when you think about in the wintertime, having a chai that's spiced with nutmeg or clove or cinnamon, right? These pungent tastes are actually warming to the body. The reason they're warming though is the interaction they have with the blood. So the pungent taste is what we use to actually interact with pulling more blood flow into a tissue. When we're looking at the digestive tract, this is very beneficial because if you can think about just how we talked about the sour taste pulling in more fluid, we're also then pulling blood flow closer with the pungent taste to that tissue, which ideally will help improve absorption. If the blood, for example, you've had the coconut, blueberry, frozen banana, frozen kale smoothie, as this passes through your digestive tract, you may actually have restriction and constriction of the blood vessels in the digestive tract, which then make it more difficult to absorb that food. When you have the pungent taste, right, maybe you even just add in some ginger, or you don't have such frozen foods, so it's a little warmer. This would actually draw more blood flow to the walls of the membranes of the digestive tract, which would make it more capable of being absorbed into the body across the membrane. So this is very important. This is why we work with this taste. And so also things like spices, right? Things like fennel, things like cardamom, things like coriander. All of the spices that are used in Ayurveda are used for this precise reason, to increase absorption, to open blood flow. And also if you think about opening blood flow, this is how we can burn off Amma. We can use this to stoke our Agni, to raise our fire, right? This is the real hot taste that we have. So we're stoking the fire, we're revving up that fire so it can burn off any mucus. It can help digest any heavy meals. So this is a little bit about the pungent taste. The next taste is the bitter taste. And so the bitter taste, for example, I have here zucchini, I have broccoli, I have kale. And so you can think about, all of these foods seem to be green. And while that's not necessarily the case, right? I think of an eggplant, for example. Its skin can sometimes be bitter, and its tissue can be quite bitter, for example. Or things like bitter melon, or things like orange peel, right? Orange peel or lime peel. So it's not necessary that the bitter taste be green foods, but a lot of times it is sort of within the realm of vegetables that we eat. A lot of vegetables that we eat are considered to be higher in the bitter taste than they are in any other. So when we look at the effects, the qualities of the bitter taste is considered to be flushing. So it helps us cleanse tissues, it helps us scrape the tissues. So for example, we've just increased the blood flow, right, with pungent taste, with the sour taste. We've increased the ability of absorption of the sweet taste, of that which is nourishing to the tissues. We've also held on to more fluid with the salty taste. Well, we also want something to help us take out and remove whatever we may have in our tissues so that we can make space for the new nutrition. And part of what's going to help flush out old dead tissue, old cells, old nutrients that are no longer able to be used within our tissues is with the bitter taste. So part of why this happens is because thousands of years ago, as our ancestors were evolving, when we would be out in the wild and we would have to taste a food to see, is this nourishing? Is this something I can eat? When we taste a food, And if you've ever had a bite of something like neem leaf, you'll know this is a heavily bitter herb. And if you were to eat a lot of neem, the effects it would have would be flushing your body. You would be urinating very much. You would be having a lot of bowel movements because our bodies understood that many of the poisons that naturally occur in nature, things that are too poisonous for our body, are bitter in nature. So in order to flush these things that the body understood as poison, right, this is part of the geniusness of our taste buds, is being able to taste something out in nature, not knowing what its effects are prior, right? Having no prior recollection of a plant, but just from tasting it, being able to have an idea of, is this something that is actually nourishing to me? Is this something that is good for me? And oftentimes, when we could taste something that was heavily bitter, we would immediately know, this is not something I should be eating. But nevertheless, these things like kale or like broccoli, like zucchini, are delicious, and they are this bitter taste that then helps us actually scrape out excess fat. It helps scrape out excess toxins. It actually helps pull toxins out of our blood and out and allows us to eliminate them. And so oftentimes from the Western perspective, the Western nutrition perspective, there's a lot of focus on eating a lot of vegetables for people who are trying to lose weight. And part of this is understood to be just the lower calorie count. But nevertheless, from the Ayurvedic perspective, it would say, well, actually, it has another effect. While I could eat the same amount of calories, as I mentioned, of broccoli or of sweet potato, right? The kilo of broccoli that I just ate is going to have a very different effect. It's going to have a much more lightening effect on my body, whereas the effect of the sweet potato will be much more building and make me more sturdy. So one is going to be more scraping, and that's the bitter taste. When we then look at our last taste, the astringent taste. The astringent taste is sort of a little different than the other tastes because it's actually more of a sensation. So while on our tongue we do have taste receptors for sweet, for salty, for sour, for spicy, when we get to the astringent taste, it's not so much that we have a specific taste receptor, as it's the general feeling that the food creates when we eat it. So when you think about astringent means that it draws fluids, it dries something up. So when we look at things like beans, if you were to, we often soak beans overnight, for example, because these are black beans, mung beans, we soak these overnight so that they can absorb fluids. We do this because if we were to cook them, they would take longer to cook because they still have the capacity to absorb more fluid. And as well, if we were to eat these, they would actually be absorbing fluids from us. And so this is considered to be what happens within our body. I've also included here some bean sprouts. So these are alfalfa sprouts. Sprouts are a really great way, especially for someone with a Vata constitution, for example, to incorporate astringent taste, but that is not going to be overly drying to the system. I've also included an apple. So if you eat a raw apple, pay attention to, does it actually leave some lasting drying effect in your mouth? And you might be surprised at what you find. So while the apple might be very sweet, might be very salty, or might be very sour, it will also have this astringent effect. Something else that I've included is a dried almond. And so as I mentioned, the soaked almond, I can take the skin off. But if you eat a dried almond, you'll notice the effect that it has on your mouth. It leaves you kind of feeling like you have a dry something in your mouth. And so the astringent taste, what it does is to absorb fluid. So just as this can be very helpful amidst all the other tastes, the sweet taste helps build the tissues. The sour, the pungent taste helps pull fluids and pull blood flow, pull enzymes, pull all of the stomach acids into the digestive tract to allow us to then absorb whatever it is we're working with. The salty taste helps us hold on to fluids in our tissues. The bitter taste helps flush out of the tissues anything that doesn't belong there. And finally, the astringent taste helps then reabsorb fluid back into the digestive tract so that it actually has a vehicle to then be transported out of the body. And this way, it's also very detoxifying. So for this reason, there's a lot of studies, for example, that show that beans can also help lower cholesterol, right? Foods with a lot of high fiber can often be considered astringent. Because when we have all of that fiber in our mouth, what does it do? It absorbs the water. And as it absorbs the water, we're actually reabsorbing into our digestive tract fluids that then can allow us to excrete any waste materials that are no longer needed. So in this way, you can see how we have these 6 tastes, right, that all are helping to boost and balance our Agni. We may also want to remove Amma by burning it up, by detoxing it out of the body, by drawing it out and tonifying the membranes with the astringent taste as we pull it out. And then, right, the sweet taste, the sour, the salty, these help build Ojas within the body. These help build our immunity, build our strength, build the reserves of our tissues. The next thing that we're going to talk about, which is our last big topic here, is then how do we use these 6 tastes to work with the doshas? So when we look at Vata dosha, the main qualities of Vata dosha are that it's cold, it's dry, and it's light. And so we essentially want to be able to work with the qualities that are going to most balance that. So the qualities that are going to most balance the dryness, the lightness, is going to be, for example, the sweet taste. The sweet taste is going to be the most grounding, the most building, the most nourishing for Vata dosha. The sour taste is going to be very therapeutic for any dry Vata. So, for example, in the fall time, in the winter, as we start to dry out, having lime water is going to help you in the mornings to hold on to more fluid. Adding a pinch of salt will help you hold the fluid in, and this will overall be improving your digestion. The salty taste for Vata dosha is what's going to help it hold on to the fluids. So we're building the tissues with the sweet taste. We're holding on to the fluids that we are so desperately in need of with the salty taste. And with the sour taste, we can then move it to where it needs to go. So it's not just stuck on our tissues, it can actually flow into the digestive system and help with digestion. These are the most therapeutic tastes. Vata needs these in the greatest proportion. And it needs the other tastes in much lesser proportion. So particularly, Vata dosha does not need much astringent because the astringent is drying in general. And also the bitter taste will in the end be drying and it will be creating more lightness in your tissues if you were to only eat vegetables, for example. And as well, the pungent taste, when we look at the pungent taste like herbs, right? Like the ones that I have here, like onion or garlic, ginger, cloves, you have cumin, you have fennel. All of these are going to be supportive of digestion without overdoing it with the Agni. Something like a chili pepper might actually overdo the Agni, which, if you think about it, if something is too hot, what's it going to do but dry up the tissues, right? If I'm obliging my digestive tract to have a greater excess of fluidity because I have a toxin, right? I have this irritation and I have to flush that out. I've now just given myself diarrhea, for example, and now I have lost more fluid than I started out with. And so it can be counterproductive. You want to find the right balance of spicing for Vata dosha, often working with herbs or things like onion and garlic. When we then look at Pitta dosha's biggest deal is that it's hot. It is hot. So if you think about during the summertime, right, when you were just hot, it's very difficult to then want to think about eating chili peppers. There's nevertheless this paradox that you find in a lot of countries like southern India or like Southeast Asia or even here in Mexico, where it tends to be quite hot in some regions, and yet people love to eat chili peppers. And so part of the theory is that when we eat the pungent foods, it helps us sweat, for example. So if you've ever had a very spicy curry, it actually helps us sweat, which then helps us cool off. But this may be a little counterproductive because for the same reason as I mentioned with Vata dosha, it can then actually create more dryness, which during the summer months, this can actually be the cumulative effect of drying out our tissues as we're sweating so much. So for Pitta dosha, what we mostly want to do is actually balance the Agni. This is really the first thing. We want to bring the Agni down a little bit. So we don't so much want to eat pungent taste. We actually want to aim for having a greater level of foods that are sweet. So the sweetness is actually going to give the fire something to do. If we think about a forest fire, right? A forest fire can just grow and grow and grow. And so we can imagine with the sweet taste, we're actually giving the fire something to do. We are putting more logs onto the flame so that it doesn't sort of just go crazy, right? We're actually giving it something so that it can expand. And otherwise, it would be doing that in our own tissue. So we want to be able to slow that with the sweet taste. As well, with Pitta dosha, when we have very high Agni, right? A very high appetite. Can you imagine someone who gets hangry, for example? Like sort of hungry plus angry, when they haven't eaten, right? Their cells have this lacking blood sugar. What do they need? Well, they need nutrition. They actually need some of that in their system. And so they don't need just the kale smoothie, they actually need to have something that's very nourishing to their tissues as well. So the second taste would be the bitter taste, because the bitter taste is going to be cooling. So when you think about the kale, for example, or a lot of the bitter tastes, part of what it does is because it helps flush out, it helps cleanse the blood. And so because it's helping to cleanse the blood of any impurities, it's actually helping reduce any struggle that the liver is having. It helps reduce the load on the liver. And the liver is what's constantly filtering our blood. Our blood is where our heat travels. So the more that we can be supportive of our liver, right? For example, the bitter taste itself is considered to be cholagogue, which actually means it helps the bile be released from the liver. And so as it helps release bile from the liver, it helps release excess heat that might otherwise burn up our own system, as we can find with Pitta dosha. The final taste that we want to look at would be the astringent taste for Pitta dosha. So eating beans, eating the sprouts, eating apples, right? Things like this can help dry out our tissues a little bit. So instead of, right, with Pitta being related to inflammation, instead of having the accumulation, right, the blockage, as I mentioned earlier, of fluids, we actually want to have something to draw that out of the body. And so this helps tonify the tissues so that they don't actually get those blockages. It helps sort of flush those out. The final taste that we're going to look at, or rather, the final thing that we want to look at is Kapha dosha, the final dosha. For Kapha dosha, the primary tastes we want to work with, and so when you think about moving through the depth of winter and into the springtime, we want to think about first using pungent taste. So oftentimes when you think about a very milky chai, for example, it has a lot of spices. It's very spicy. You sometimes even have it more spicy than sweet that you even notice. And so part of what this is doing is something like milk, which can be very heavy, can be very hard to digest for a lot of people. The more spices you put in it, the more likelihood you are generating within the body of being able to absorb that food, being able to absorb that nutrition. So the same is true for Kapha. With Kapha, the Agni tends to be low. It tends to be cool and cold. So we actually mostly want to be able to boost the Agni. We really want to be able to create the circumstances within the body where the Agni and the metabolism, the digestion is all raised up. And so using a lot of pungent spices is what's going to be very ideal within any of the food choices you have. So while you will have a balance of all six tastes for Kapha, having a lot of well-spiced meals is essential. Next, because Kapha also tends to be damp and it tends to be heavy, we want to look at how can we increase dryness and how can we increase lightness. So one way to increase the dryness, as I mentioned, is with the pungent taste, right? Drying out those tissues. Another is with the astringent. So the astringent quality also helps pull out some of the fluids, helps pull out and tonify some of those fluids that otherwise, the tissues that otherwise might be getting sort of flaccid and sort of weak because they don't have a lot of strength, right? They're maybe getting too damp. If you think about a piece of paper, for example, that then gets damp, it becomes more wavy. When you dry it up again, it becomes more solid, more structured. And so in this way, we're helping Kapha dosha move from sort of this collapsed way of being into this more structured, solid way of being. When we look at bitter taste, what the bitter taste helps do is actually then create more lightness. So while Kapha has that heavy quality, that heavy and dull quality, we're actually warming it up. We're pulling out some of the excess fluid retention, for example. And then we're also then scraping any excess fat, any excess muscle, any excess tissues that have not been well formed because the Agni was low. So this is why we want to then focus on plenty of veggies, plenty of fresh beans and dals, for example, and having plenty of spices. And so it's not to say that as these doshas go, that they cannot eat the other tastes. In fact, everyone needs to eat all six tastes. eating all 6 tastes, and especially even having all 6 tastes at one single meal, is going to be essential for allowing all of those cascades in your body, from building to cleansing, for all of those to be able to happen within your body. So every single human needs all 6 of these tastes, but depending on your dosha, depending on your current imbalances, and depending on the season, for example, you actually want to be able to shift in what proportions am I consuming these foods. Because, as we go back to the very core of Ayurvedic nutrition, it has to do with being able to balance your Agni, being able to then get rid of any Amma, and then to build Ojas. And being able to refine Kapha dosha, being able to refine the greatest essence of our own cellular vitality, is what we're going to do through a very well-rounded, very expansive view on our nutrition that allows us to be able to eat as much as we can that is going to be able to be digested. And so we want to focus on, can I digest this? And how might the tastes that I'm working with support my digestion of them? So, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please let me know if you have any additional questions. And coming up soon, there will also be a video on how to make khichdi for 3 doshas. So, that will be our next video. Khichdi is considered to be the Ayurvedic spring cleansing food, while Western nutrition maybe does spring cleanses that are like juice fasts or water fasts even. Ayurveda would consider that these are very harsh on the body. And so you actually want to be able to nourish the body, give it the 6 tastes, but you want to be able to reduce the strain on the digestive tract. So this helps reset the Agni, helps us burn out any Amma, and then reset the body, rekindle our fire, so that we can move through spring and the rest of the year with a newfound look on building Ojas throughout the year. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in that next video. Looking forward to it, and namaste.